Welcome to my channel where we cover the lore of video games. We cover all kinds from the mainstream to the indie, so I hope you enjoy your stay, and welcome to the Chronicler of Lore. In this den of pirates and thieves, those who cast the darkest shadows are wont to wear white. Helps them blend in, disappear into the streetscape. In that sense, I reckon ye were born for this line of work. So the man mused indifferently as he grabbed at the small boy's silver locks. They were not father and son, nor blood relatives of any sort. Just a child who knew no life but that on the streets, and a merchant of ill repute who was all too eager to employ the urchin in one shady scheme after the next. Business partners, and nothing more. It was a different time, back in the days before Admiral Murthweb forbade piracy and brought a measure of order to Lemsa. In that lawless place, a street rat could do worse for allies than a black marketeer of questionable moral fiber. Needless to say, some patrons were bad, while others were worse. Allow yourself to be lured in by promise of easy coin, and you might find yourself with a cutlass to your chin. There was but one constant. Once the job was done, both parties moved on, sometimes without so much as a fare thee well. And thus Thancred spent his formative years. For better or for worse, he was an apt pupil, agile of body and sharp of mind. He could take care of himself and gave the dangers that lurked at every turn a suitably wide berth. At one point, he even managed to ingratiate himself with the dutiful sisters, keepers of the code, feared even by the most fearsome of buccaneers, and yet, in the end, he chose to move on. There was something about them, the quiet passion, the pride they took in their work, that never sat right with the boy. It was by no means a glamorous life, nor less an easy one, but it was the only life he knew. That is, until the day he took it into his head to ply his trade on the piers. Word had it that a trader was arriving from across the seas, and coin purse would be flush with gil and ripe for the taking. The elderly Ellison whom he chose as his mark had other ideas, however. No sooner had the boy lifted a hand than he found himself flat on his back, his limbs bound by powerful magics. A short life in the gaol beckoned, or perhaps a quick death. And then the strangest thing happened. The man took him by the hand, led him to a quiet corner away from the bustling crowds, looked him straight in the eye and said, "My name is Louisoix Leveillé. I am a scholar from across the seas. What is your name, child?" "Thancred," the boy mumbled, still in disbelief. "Thancred what? Have you any family?" the old man continued with a sympathetic smile. "Just Thancred," the boy shrugged, "and I don't have a family, at least none that I know of." The man who had called himself Louisoix paused for a moment, stroking his beard, before appearing to come to a conclusion. "You are quick and able beyond your years. Were you only in a place where you could learn to use these gifts for the good of all, rather than merely as a tool for your own survival? Why, there is no telling what life you might lead." Thancred listened in silence, his frown speaking volumes. "It's not as if I chose this, you know." But Louisoix responded with a sad yet knowing smile, and the words that would change the boy's life forever. "Come with me to Charlian. You are a gifted child, and there is much that I would teach you." And so it was that Thancred's new life began. To commemorate the occasion, Thancred was to claim the surname Waters. Such flourishes had been unnecessary on the Lamentin streets, but will be indispensable in more respectable locales. Thancred chafed at first, not keen to declare his lowly heritage to all and sundry, but Master Louisoix would brook no opposition. "Thaliac, guardian of the rushing rivers and purveyor of knowledge," the sage mused, "a lad such as yourself could do far worse for a protector." And so, Thancred grudgingly accepted the name he would come to wear with pride. Louisoix also found a suitable mentor for the child, an old hand in covert operations who would train Thancred to follow in his printless footsteps. Charlian was a society that valued knowledge and expertise in all forms, and shadowy agents were not shunned as disreputable rogues, but respected as key contributors to the nation. It was in such a capacity that Louisoix hoped the boy might excel and find his true calling. Stunned as he was at this turn of events, Thancred was no fool. He understood the future Louisoix envisioned for him and endeavored to do all he could to meet his patron's expectations. He honed his body that he might infiltrate the most impregnable of strongholds in the harshest environments, and his mind that he might charm the wariest merchants and socialites in the most critical of circumstances. Before he knew it, the streetwise child of the laments and alleyway was no more. In his place stood a confident youth who could pose as anyone's friend and confidant long enough to procure the knowledge his client demanded. A short while later, Thancred's surpassing skills were recognized, and upon his skin was inscribed the sigil of an archon. When Louisoix gazed upon this mark, he could scarce contain his joy. The boy he had personally led out of penury and taken under his wing had realized his potential. It was at about this time that Thancred first met the child he knew only as Acilia, one of the first recruits to Master Louisoix's circle of knowing. He was on a top-secret mission in Ul'dah, tasked with doing what he could to quell the flames of war that threatened to engulf Eorzea. To his acquaintances, he was simply a traveling bard, hoping to hone his skills and study swordplay in this land of gladiators and mercenaries. In truth, his mission was to use his knowledge of the primals as a bargaining chip, that he might gain the trust of the Syndicate, the Sultana, and any others who wielded influence in this land overflowing with wealth and intrigue, in the hope that he might stave off, however briefly, the threat of warlike Garlemald. But the best laid plans of men oft go awry, and it was not long until tragedy reared its ugly head, and the child Thancred had only just befriended was consigned to a crueler fate than even he had known. As the dust settled, the young girl clung to her father, pleading with the gods for him to remain just a moment longer. A part of him was keenly aware that the child was all alone now, as he had once been. This part pitied her, knowing what she would be forced to sacrifice to survive in this cruel and unfeeling world. Yet another part of him, a more selfish part he would admit, seethed with pain and regret. As much as he had grown, as strong as he had become, in the end, he was powerless. I failed her when she needed me most. Fortunately, the child was not without friends in the world. The songstress Flamen soon resolved to serve as her guardian and protector, and so Thancred's role in the child's story came to an end, or seemed as if it might. But for reasons he struggled to explain, he could not let go so easily. Perhaps it was the knowledge that the child's father had betrayed his Garlean spy masters before his death, and that danger might still follow in his wake. Or perhaps it was something far simpler, though the former made for a convenient excuse. Needless to say, he had many more important responsibilities. Nevertheless, whenever his duties brought him to Ul'dah, he would make sure to look in on Acilia lest she get caught up in anything unsavory. Dispatching common louts was easy enough, but on those occasions he found himself face to face with an undercover Garlean operative, no doubt one who had followed her father's trail, shivers would run down his spine. When it became clear that it would be nigh impossible to shake their trail, Thancred decided to step forth from the shadows and make a proposition. You should take on a new name and assume a new life. Only then might you free yourself from your father's legacy. Trust me, it is for your own good. Acilia looked into his eyes and considered the implication of his words without prejudice. After a moment, she nodded in agreement. Very well, but what name shall I take? Thancred closed his eyes, thought briefly for a moment, then spoke. Minfilia, he said with quiet conviction. Minfilia Ward. It was nearly as inspired a name as the one Louisoix had convinced him to embrace so many years ago. A common enough name for a Highlander girl, yet not one so overused as to draw unnecessary attention. A name that would keep her safe in Thancred's absence. Minfilia, she said with a smile. Yes, I rather like the sound of it. One night, after seeing to some reconnaissance task or other, Thancred found himself aimlessly wandering the streets of Ul'dah, as he was wont to do. It was then he spotted Minfilia, sporting a pickaxe and other assorted gear. The girl is nothing if not devoted to the cause. Is something the matter, he asked? Surely your task didn't require you to stay out quite so late. Oh, Thancred, Minfilia responded calmly. It's nothing, really. I simply got distracted. For all her outward projection of strength, something was clearly weighing on the girl's mind, and so Thancred flashed an understanding smile and offered to escort her home. It was not far to the humble abode where she lived with Flamen, and he had hoped that he might learn more of her troubles. The conversation quickly turned from that topic to the rumors of the day, and several inconsequential laughs later, they arrived at their destination. Thank you, Thancred, Minfilia offered before fixing him with a look. Do take care not to overdo it at the tavern. You are too quick to forget yourself, especially in the company of women. I will heed your sage advice as if my very life depended on it, Thancred replied in a tone that made it clear he had no intention of doing anything of the sort. Minfilia sighed as she pushed the wooden door open. For a moment, the warm orange-hued glow of the lanterns within bathed the alley and Thancred in light. With a farewell wave, the girl stepped inside, and as the door closed behind her with a creak, that fleeting glimpse of warmth and tranquility vanished along with her. From beyond the threshold, 1,000 miles away, came a gentle voice. "Welcome home, my dear." Alone in the alley, Thancred took a deep breath. It is not for you. He had seen the girl safely home, and though it had been a simple task, he felt prouder than he had in a long, long time. How many years has it been? Thancred had long since lost count. He pondered the memory as he delved deeper into the tunnels beneath the city of Yulmore in the first, quite literally a world away from home. Just as he had been many times in his younger days, he was here on a mission to rescue a young girl. The streets of Yulmore were lined with soaring, majestic buildings carved from pristine white marble. Though there were many differences, of course, Thancred could not help but be reminded of Limsa Lominsa. In this den of pirates and thieves, those who cast the darkest shadows are wont to wear white. He had shed the Yulmoran soldier's garb he had worn to gain entry, donning instead his own coat of purest white. The garments were light and flowing, befitting a man who had traded 2 daggers for a gunblade, a man resolved to serve as a guardian and protector. The white, too, was Thancred's choice, a color that would allow him to travel unmarked in this world flooded with light. Were he an honorable knight burning with a sense of duty, no doubt he would have chosen to clad himself in black, raising high the villain's flag in a land where despots draped themselves in the mantle of virtue. But such indulgences would have to wait until after he had saved her. The reef from which the city of Yulmore was carved extended far below the surface of the ocean. The massive subterranean chamber in which Thancred found himself was said to have been used as a storehouse in one age, and as a safe haven to shelter the people from sin-eaters in another. Under the rule of Lord Varthry, it had been converted into a makeshift gao and pantry for Miol, the substance that served to provide sustenance to the citizens of Yulmore and to secure their loyalty. It was the deepest chamber of those cavernous halls that Thancred sought, a location he had identified only after months of reconnaissance. He evaded the eyes of the watchmen, painlessly and effortlessly dispatching those whom he deemed might interfere with their escape. Were he on his own, infiltrating the most heavily guarded areas of Yulmore would be a simple task. But to spirit away a prisoner, a child who knew nothing of the battlefield no less, he would need to take every precaution. After disposing of yet another guard, Thancred arrived at his destination. Though his allies in the first called her Minfilia, the Exarch had cautioned him not to expect a reunion. Even so, Thancred felt a connection with this girl he had yet to meet. He knew in his heart of hearts what he must do. Exhaling softly, he turned the key and unlocked the door. The chamber was unnervingly ordinary. Where Thancred had expected a dank cell, he found instead a simple yet all too comfortable looking bed and a smallish chest of drawers. A desk and matching chairs suitable for study, equipped with parchment and quill. The centerpiece of the room was a mighty bookshelf lined from top to bottom, end to end with impressive tomes. Aside from the lack of windows, one would scarcely have cause to complain. Yet this made this makeshift cell all the more unsettling. There was no despair, but nor was there any hope to be found. It was simply a place for the God King of Yulmore to keep the Oracle of Light as his prisoner and pet until the end of days. Sitting atop the bed in the center of the chamber, the young child turned to her unexpected visitor and stared at him with eyes of crystal. You are... The girl's voice was at once reminiscent of and entirely different from young Asilius. Another life had been waiting beyond that door, a life of love and hope, of family. Minfilia, it's time to go. As Thancred spoke the name, he saw a smile in the dark, her silhouette against the blinding light. He extended a hand. After a moment's hesitation, the girl took it. This time, I'll make it right. The evening found them at their usual table at the Shiokaze hostelry. Though he and his traveling companion had by now become a familiar sight in Kugane, few there had any inkling just how odd a pair they made. A dragon slayer, albeit retired, and a dragonette. "It's well you had me to get us out of our predicament," Onkai observed in that insufferably smug tone of his, and not for the first time. But this, Estinian decided, was one time too many. Face darkening, he snatched a piece of sun-dried squid, known to the locals as surume, from the plate between them, making the diminutive dragon blink. A predicament of your making. Your false lead that caused us needless toil. Tearing off some chewy squid with his teeth, he let out an irritated sigh. Gods, how did it come to this? But the answer he knew all too well. It had begun amidst smoke and ash at the Gimlet Dark, where he had plucked the warrior of light from the jaws of death. Having borne his stricken comrade to the Ishgardian encampment, he had promptly taken his leave, reasoning that his skill with the lance would be of more use on the battlefield than in the infirmary. And so he had turned his steps back towards the fighting, minded to lend the alliance his strength, only to learn that it was no longer needed, for Xenos had withdrawn from the front lines, leaving the Imperial forces defanged and in disarray. Thus had Estinian found himself aimlessly wandering the snow-swept fields of Kurthus, which is where he had heard a familiar draconic voice calling out to him, Onkai. In the past he had aided the Dragonette in his quest to find his sire's long-lost consort, a journey to the far east which had, it would seem, given the creature a taste for adventure, and now he wanted Estinian to accompany him on another. "I've no interest in playing nursemaid," Estinian had replied in a tone that brooked no discussion. But Onkai was not to be discouraged. Having inquired as to the Elezen's age, he retorted with a smirk, "I've lived 10 full your years. It would seem I'm the one who must play nursemaid." In such manner did their conversation unfold, and a pain began to manifest in Estinian's temples, first niggling, then raging, until, driven to the limits of his patience, he had declared with a snarl, "I had forsworn the slaying of dragons, but for you, mayhap I shall make an exception." This said, he had drawn his lance and made as if to thrust it at Onkai, who duly cheered. "Yes, that's the spirit," Onkai gleefully exclaimed before proceeding to apprise Estinian of his plans. He had previously heard tell, he explained, of an intriguing legend, that of Seriu, a dragon worshipped in the Far East as a benevolent guardian, but feared in certain corners as a man-eating fiend. I wish to ascertain the truth of the tales. If this dragon devours man-flesh as some believe, it falls to us to end its reign of terror. So it was that the Azure Dragoon had set forth once more to the Far East, a none too willing traveling companion to an all too willful Dragonette, and through painstaking effort, trudging hither and yon, gathering information, they had learned the truth of the legend, to their mutual disappointment. For the dragon known as Seriu was no dragon at all, at least not the kind they knew, but something more akin to a serpent. And to compound their chagrin, their quest having dragged on far longer than intended, they had found themselves at the limit of their funds. For some days they were forced to endure empty bellies, but their luck had turned when Orkai came to the attention of the proprietor of Kugane's most famous hostelry. Like many a Hingan, the woman believed dragons to be bringers of good fortune, and she had offered them board and lodging in exchange for attracting customers. And here we are, a spectacle for drunkards. "How ungrateful," Onkai said with mock indignance. "I find myself less and less inclined to sear your squid." As little as Estinian cared for the dragon's pertness, at that moment he cared less for the dry rice wine without a savory accompaniment. "Fine, I'm grateful," he managed, resisting the urge to roll his eyes. "Now sear me another one, will you?" Seemingly placated, Onkai breathed fire upon the surume, which released a mouth-watering aroma as it crackled and charred. Estinian allowed it a moment to cool before helping himself to another bite of this strangely addictive snack. Even as he savored the flavor and texture, footsteps rang out from the direction of the tavern's entrance. "Welcome to the Shiokaze Hostelry," Onkai cheerily called out to the newly arrived patrons. With a brief shake of his head, Estinian drew breath to offer his own half-hearted greeting, only for the words to die on his lips when he turned around and saw the two Lalafellan maidens standing upon the threshold. "There you are!" shrilled the one in the pink kimono. Though she had adopted the local attire, there was no mistaking Tataru Taru, the Scion's indomitable receptionist. And beside her, even less mistakable in her distinctive robe, was Krau Baldessian, staring wide-eyed at him. Whatever it was that the Archon saw, it clearly amused her, for she was suddenly racked with spasms of poorly stifled laughter. "Forgive me," she said tearily, struggling for breath. I had heard that the Azure Dragoon had hung up his lance, but I did not expect that he would take up the serving tray in its stead. To that assessment, Estinian could offer no retort, and as much as her amusement irked him, above all he was troubled by the creeping sense that he was about to be drawn into yet another bothersome affair. He turned to Onkai. "'Tis time we went our separate ways, little one, but so long as you remain here, you shan't want for comfort. Fare you well." Sparing the visitors no further glance, Estinian picked up his travel sack with the tip of his lance, swung it over his shoulder, and leapt. He shot up to the holstery's upper level, landing gracefully amidst startled revelers, who broke out in rapturous applause at what they assumed must be a performance. Disregarding the ovation, he dashed through the door and out into the night. He knew at once where to bend his steps, Kugane Ohashi, for across this bridge there lay the rest of Shisu, entry to which was forbidden to all Asians save a privileged few. Surely it would be the last place they would think to look for him, but he had scarcely settled into his spot against the bridge balustrade to let the haze of the wine clear from his head when from among the passing traffic the Lalafels appeared again. "You do know they won't let you pass without one of these." Tataru waved a parchment in front of him bearing Far Eastern script and a crimson seal. An entry permit. Why am I not surprised? But what was surprising was how quickly they managed to track him down. At that moment, a boat plying the channel below chanced to draw near. He did not stop to think and sprung onto its mast. A few moments and several leaps later, Estinian was taking in the city from the roof of Kugane Castle, a self-satisfied grin upon his face. Let them try and find me here. Absent-mindedly, he withdrew what was left of his surume from the pocket where he had secreted it, raised it to his mouth, and stared. On a nearby walkway, two Lalafels were emerging, led by the Sekisegumi blade bearing a lantern. What sorcery is this? In that instant, it occurred to Estinian that they may well have a good reason to seek him out. The thought quickly faded, however. Perhaps it was the wine, a potent variety sourced from the main island, or perhaps it was simply his nature, but the more they pursued him, the more determined he became to elude them. Just need to steer clear until morning. Thus resolved, he stepped off the rooftop and dropped down to the ground. After what seemed an eternity, the night sky began to take on the gray of dawn. A little longer and the Kuroboro Maru would leave port and bear Estinian away, beyond the reach of Scion troubles. But even as he allowed himself to hope, the self-same cheery voice that had haunted him all night rang out. "Anyone would think you were trying to avoid us." "You cannot be serious." Groaning inwardly, he turned to face his unrelenting pursuers, his mind racing as he considered his options. It was then that the Baldessian woman fell to one knee, cradling her head. Are you all right?" Tataru crouched down beside her companion in a state of alarm. The Archon had plainly overexerted herself during their night-long game of cat and mouse. Unable to stop himself from feeling a measure of culpability, he was about to proffer a hand when Krau's shoulders began to shake with laughter, as poorly stifled as before. "Oh, Estinian, never would I have imagined." She made an effort to look at him, but the sight of his face seemed only to add to her amusement, sending her into further spasms. "What's this now? Did you see something from his past?" Tataru asked, her voice dripping with curiosity. Though it was already well on the way to being a warm day, Estinian felt a chill to rival a Curthian night. He knew that, like the Warrior of Light in his cell, Krau was blessed with the echo, and could peer into the past through another's eyes. He could not begin to guess which mortifying episode in his life she had just witnessed. There were simply too many. Finally composing herself, Krau stood upright and regarded Estinian with a look of pity. "Be at ease. I am not so heartless as to reveal what I saw. Not here and now, at any rate. Damn you to the bottom of the seventh hell. But enough about that," she continued sweetly. "We were hoping to speak with you, if you have a moment." Estinian's shoulders rose and fell as he sighed in resignation. The chase was over. Later that morning, Estinian stood upon the deck of a merchant vessel bound for Razathan on his way to the Empire. He had been charged with finding, and if possible destroying, an alchemical weapon by the name of Black Rose. Left unchecked, the Garleans would inevitably bring the deadly gas to bear against their enemies, Ishgard among them. The method of his recruitment apart, he could not well stand idly by while his comrades were thus threatened, nor could he deny that he was well suited to the task. As he gazed out at the ruby sea, he rested a hand upon the reassuring weight hanging at his waist, a leather pouch heavy with coin. The spoils of some lucrative venture pertaining to Far Eastern legends, according to Tataru. Yet another bothersome journey, but at least I shan't want for funds. Reaching into his travel sack, he pulled out a piece of freshly seared surame, a parting gift from Ornkai. He took a bite, making sure to chew it slowly. There was no telling when he would see any more. At around the same time, Totoro and Krau were sitting at the Shiokaze hostelry, taking refreshments with their new friend Ornkai. "So tell us, Krau," Totoro began, her cheeks flushed from the rice wine. "What scandalous event from Esthenian's past did you see?" Like the morning sun peering out over the horizon, a coy smile slowly broke on Krau's lips. "I'm sorry. Whatever gave you the impression I saw such a thing?" Their boisterous laughter could be heard as far away as the water's edge, but thankfully not beyond. Objective: to record and analyze events surrounding the 8th Umbral Calamity based on information extrapolated from statements and reports made by Sid Garland. Following a series of decisive victories, the former imperial colonies of Doma and Alamigo overthrew their provincial rulers and secured independence from Garlemald. This prompted other occupied territories to rise up against their oppressors and join forces with the Eorzean and Eastern alliances. The Gallians responded by marching the bulk of their troops to Gimlet on the Alamigan border, where the allied armies gathered to repel them. Though peace negotiations were attempted, the differences between the opposing sides proved to be irreconcilable, with open warfare the only viable recourse. Against expectation, the well-equipped and highly organized Imperial legions failed to capitalize on their early advantage, allowing the Alliance to stage a counterattack. One possible cause for such an ineffectual display on the part of the Gallian troops is the high proportion of conscripted soldiers who, in the words of Master Sid, lack the conviction required to maximize their combat capabilities. Unfortunately, I am not programmed to assess such unquantifiable variables, and this theory must therefore be dismissed as mere conjecture. I can, however, state with some degree of certainty that the arrival of the ones known as the Scions of the Seventh Dawn was a critical factor in the Garleans' defeat. After the Empire's withdrawal, Sid Garland and his Ironworks colleagues, including the elusive Nero Scava, traveled to the Burn on the Othardian subcontinent to bolster the field generators at Seriu's Wall in preparation for the Garleans' next offensive. They set about their work, unaware of the events unfolding elsewhere that would change the course of history until they received the first report, which, according to Master Sid, was unusually brief. The Garleans had deployed a powerful new weapon on the Eorzean front. We tried to contact our comrades at Rauga's Reach, but received no reply. Despite lacking several essential details, the message was entirely accurate. The reason the sender had been unable to communicate with said comrades was simple. They had been annihilated by Black Rose, a poisonous gas developed by the Garleans. This ingenious weapon halts the flow of ether within organic beings, causing near immediate cessation of respiratory functions. Being highly potent and capable of rapid dispersion across a wide area, the majority of settlements in nearby Alamigo were almost entirely depopulated in the aftermath. Contemporary reports state that the damage extended far beyond Alliance-held regions, such as the Black Shroud and Thanalin, to several Imperial territories, resulting in significant loss of life. As my present configuration is only equipped with basic audio-visual receptors, I must draw my conclusions from limited and, I am compelled to admit, unreliable sources of information. At the time of Black Rose's deployment, I was otherwise engaged deep within Ogamoro and was unable to make a detailed observation on the weapon's effects. The yellow-plumed creature that was accompanying me appeared to sense something at the approximate moment that the gas was released, gazing into empty space with an expression that mortals described as perturbed. Objective: to record and analyze events surrounding the 8th Umbral Calamity based on information acquired from Sid Garland. Master Garland has made numerous attempts to initiate conversation with me, despite my current vessel being no more than a simplistic automaton conceived as a plaything, lacking any oratory mechanisms with which to respond. These utterances, though made in a state of obvious intoxication, provided me with invaluable data. While the individual recordings contain a wide range of observations, many are superfluous to my investigation, so I've compiled only those I deem relevant. Black Rose wrought immeasurable destruction to organic life forms, resulting in widespread environmental upheaval. The ambient ether ceased to flow along its normal channels and stagnated, rendering the land barren and uninhabitable. Inevitably, the wild imbalance of nature energies affected neighboring regions and, in some cases, led to sudden and unpredictable alterations in flora and fauna. Overnight, the crops on which man relied for sustenance became toxic, further increasing the death toll. In the aftermath of these unprecedented disasters, the communities formed by sentient beings fell into disarray, and all forms of societal organization from small settlements to entire nations were abandoned as individuals struggled desperately to avoid annihilation. It did not take long for the cascading environmental repercussions to be felt in Garlean territory. Due to the after effects of Black Rose, the ceruleum that once supported daily life in the Empire and powered its Magitech armies failed to combust. The machines duly fell silent, bereft of the energy required to set them in motion. The creatures that escaped the initial devastation were thrust into a battle for survival. Among them, those belonging to supposedly civilized races were particularly quick to turn on their brethren in a bid to seize control of land and resources. While they attempted to justify these wanton acts of violence with a range of superficially logical explanations, it is my assessment that greed and desperation were the primary motivating factors behind their actions. Master Sid and his colleagues frequently referred to this situation as a quagmire, though in a figurative rather than literal sense. Much like an actual quagmire, it threatened to pull mankind into an inescapable predicament. Correct interpretation of the audio data recorded at the time is dependent on accurate comprehension of this metaphorical expression. The mortals who found themselves in this quagmire were no longer governed or protected by social conventions or societal norms, instead reverting to a more primitive way of life, closer to those referred to as beastkin. However, certain groups of sentient beings were reluctant to accept this descent into savagery, with Garlean Ironworks being one example. Its members expended considerable time and effort in largely unsuccessful attempts to bring an end to the numerous conflicts that had erupted. In addition, they hunted down and reprimanded those who sought to profit from the desperation of their fellow survivors, and offered a safe haven to the exploited. While their deeds earned them the support of many like-minded individuals, the number of comrades gained paled in comparison to those lost in the days which followed. I recorded one particular incident in which a Lalafellan engineer was carried back to headquarters after being mauled by a carnivorous beast while overseeing the digging of a well. Despite the treatments administered by trained Chirurgeons, his wounds were beyond healing, and his vital signs began to fade. As he lay dying, one Ironworks member in particular, a Rogadan male considered to be the stricken Lalafel's closest friend, refused to leave his bedside. Gripping the patient's limp hand and whispering words of encouragement appeared to revive him for a few brief moments. Drawing on his final reserves of stamina, the diminutive engineer demanded that his counterpart live on and produce offspring to continue his legacy. To this, the larger man responded with a trembling voice, "It's high time you started a family yourself," though that was, regrettably, not a realistic prospect. Smiling, the Lalafell replied, "Sorry, but no one will ever compare to her." These were his final words. The Lalafell's death prompted an emotional response from my feathered associate, who pressed his tear-stained cheek against the lifeless body. Sometime later, once Master Sid and his colleagues had finally exhausted their supply of tears, they gathered for a lengthy discussion, their expressions growing ever more despondent as the talks continued. They eventually arrived at the conclusion that they lacked the means to restore their shattered world, with their only viable option being to entrust the future generations with the knowledge that they had accumulated, in the hope that their successors may one day find a solution. This was met with some resistance, however, as many expressed disapproval at the idea of forsaking those in the present day in order to save a world they would never live to see. Unable to deny this, Master Sid simply nodded and said, "Even so, our sacrifice will be for naught." With that, Garlean Ironworks found what I believe to be its true purpose. Objective: to continue recording and analyzing events surrounding the 8th Umbral Calamity. The researchers of the Garlean Ironworks continued to investigate the process by which Black Rose, possessed of a destructive power far exceeding its creator's expectations, triggered the 8th Umbral Calamity. They believed that understanding the nature of this catastrophe could reveal a means by which it might be averted entirely. Their aim was to change the past, to create an alternate reality in which the calamity never occurred, a feat rendered conceivable by their knowledge of the advanced technologies of fallen civilizations. However, many of those who would bear the burden of continued existence in a world ravaged by Black Rose failed to see this as a viable stratagem. Such responses were consistent with my projections, as it is generally the primary objective of all life forms to secure their own survival in the here and now. Many of Master Sid's followers either refused to cooperate or expressed a desire to leave the Ironworks altogether. Certain former employees went as far as to appropriate equipment and supplies by force before heading into the wilderness to fend for themselves. Although the vast majority opposed Master Sid's radical proposition, a select few remained to lend their assistance. Research into the 8th Umbral Calamity continued, aided by experts in the fields of magic and ethereal science. During this period, one loyal scholar noted that while preventing the disaster may not solve all the problems that had afflicted the world of the past, the one dubbed the Warrior of Light would still be alive. The various members of the team each had their own personal connection with the deceased, and the notion of creating an alternative past in which their hero survived the calamity met with unanimous approval. It is impossible to discern the manner in which this theory affected the motivation of the Ironworks staff and their associates, or whether some other external factor triggered a sudden increase in their mental faculties, but the fact that they eventually succeeded in unraveling the mystery surrounding the Eighth Umbral calamity is a matter of record. In addition, by presenting their plan as an attempt to save the Warrior of Light rather than a bid to rewrite history, they were able to gain the support from survivors of many different species and subgroups. Representatives from various settlements came to donate resources and foodstuffs to Garland Ironworks, despite possessing barely enough to sustain themselves. Many of them were also acquainted with the Warrior of Light, some even claiming to have been beneficiaries of the late hero's acts of philanthropy. A semi-aquatic creature known as a Namazu, who had arrived bearing donations, imparted information apparently gleaned from premonitory dreams. The following is an extract of his recorded testimony. The world was never in such a ruinous state in the visions sent to me by the Big One. No. Segetsu the Enlightened said that the future I witnessed was a part of another history, a different chain of events with no Eighth Umbral calamity at all, whatever that means. It remains to be seen whether this is anything more than the nonsensical ramblings of an anthropomorphic catfish, but I shall store it in my databanks for future analysis. Over time, support for the Ironworks continued to grow, their cause finding allies in the most unexpected of quarters. Memorably, during a routine mission transporting research materials, one of their vessels was ambushed by bandits, only to be rescued by an immense airship captained by a golden-haired female claiming to be a sky pirate. She is reported to have made the following declaration. My mother was once snatched from the jaws of death by this champion of yours. As her successor as Queen of the Skies, I mean to see that debt repaid in full. Instances of Ironworks representatives being extricated from perilous situations were abnormally frequent, their apparent saviors including multiple non-human entities. In one such example, an emissary who was attacked and thrown overboard while crossing the Ruby Sea reported waking upon the shore of a nearby island with a vague recollection of having been borne to safety by a large beast, possibly a Chelonian or serpentine in nature. In a similar incident, an ill-equipped messenger would have fallen to his death while traversing the peaks of Somal, were it not for the intervention of a colossal white-winged creature, later identified as a dragon. According to the official report, there was a brief exchange in which the Dravanian rescuer expressed his disinterest in the affairs of man, particularly his insatiable thirst for conflict, before disappearing into the clouds. It must be noted that due to the lack of independent eyewitnesses or material evidence, this account remains unverified. Objective: to continue recording and analyzing events surrounding the Eighth Umbral calamity. With admirable dedication for a mortal, Master Sid continued to labor until the end of his natural lifespan. The years of painstaking research clearly took their toll, however. One day, as he penned the final words of his grand theory, I observed his hand quiver as if the weight of his quill had at last defeated him. Breathing a weary sigh, he turned to Master Nero, who made the same shrugging gesture that I have observed on many occasions before, saying, "Well, it certainly took you long enough." Previous analysis of Master Nero's behavioral pattern indicates that this was meant as a compliment, though Master Sid's exasperated expression appeared to suggest it was not received as such. Be that as it may, the brief smile which subsequently crossed his lips led me to believe that he understood his counterpart's intent. Slowly rising to his feet, he then shuffled towards a well-worn device referred to as a boil master and poured coffee into 2 metallic containers, passing one to Master Nero. They duly raised the receptacles and brought them together in a percussive toasting motion, a ritual I have seldom witnessed, there having been little cause for celebration. The pair sipped their drinks, and for once Master Nero refrained from expressing his distaste for the brew, a noteworthy anomaly. Master Sid then turned his gaze to the stack of papers on the desk and initiated the following exchange. "So, do you think this mad scheme of ours will ever come to fruition?" "Only time will tell, Garland, lest you forget. The road to ruin is lined with good intentions, which your young protégés have in abundance. We can but hope they do a better job of saving the world than we did." "Indeed, it's in their hands now." No further words were exchanged, and my sensors yielded no indication as to the thoughts which occupied the pair's minds. So as they stood in silence, I attempted to form my own answer to Sid's question. I could by this time emulate the cognitive processes of organic beings, as I had done on one particular occasion many years ago, in the moments immediately prior to the irreversible dissolution of my previous vessel. With what might be termed wakeful eyes, I reviewed the reports made by Ironworks members following their investigations into the Crystal Tower, the mechanical primal known as Alexander, and the interdimensional rift, the findings of which were instrumental in formulating the plan to alter the past. Thus did I discover that each of these missions had one common element. They ended with a key figure entering a form of self-imposed exile, not unlike a deep slumber. At times such as these, when one is to be separated from one's companions, whether it be by sleep or by death, there is a phrase which I have found to be particularly fitting: good night. And after the night comes the morning, as the sun rises to greet the new day. While it may already be too late to mend this dying world, there are those who would strive to create a place where the sun will shine again, not for their own sake, but for those in a past that may yet be saved. I think this must be what mortals call hope. It is beautiful. In a time long forgotten, men and gods were one and the same, and upon the star that was their home, men ruled supreme over the corporeal world, within and without, which existed in an ethereal realm. Throughout the ages, this realm has been called many names, but in the beginning it was known as the underworld, the place to which departed souls returned. As water flows to the seas and rises to the sky before raining upon the land once more, the underworld was a fundamental part of the circle of life, and for this reason, it was regarded at once with familiarity and reverence by men who, despite their godlike powers, could not claim dominion over it. Wise though they were, they could catch only fleeting glimpses of the realm, channel but a sliver of its power, and do naught to control its ceaseless flow. However, among those who abided in that age, there were a chosen few who possessed an affinity with the underworld, and among their number, one stood tall. Another idyllic evening had descended upon Amarat. Citizens strolled carelessly along the streets of the gleaming capital, identical black-robed figures bathed in gentle torchlight. Some would while the night away in agreeable company, others retired early to their beds. The illumination served equally well for both. But he had chosen to spend the time alone at a park, reclining upon the manicured lawn. The cowl of his robe had fallen back to reveal locks of white hair, which framed the unique red mask covering the upper half of his face, the sole item among his apparel that was his, and his alone. To see him lazing there, most would assume he was simply gazing up at the stars, or perhaps the glittering towers that seemed to reach for them. The sights that were reflected in his eyes, however, were a far cry from any seen by most men. What he beheld was the ether that comprised all things, radiating life. From the depths of the land to the heights of the firmament, its light shone bright. Here and there, lives that had served their purpose drifted upon the current before suddenly plunging down into the underworld. That he could behold these wonders was not a wonder in itself. Many were blessed with the sight, yet very few indeed were as strong in the gift as him. As a man focused his gaze upon the object of his interest, he needed but to direct his attention towards the ether to behold all the lives born upon the currents. So acute was his vision, he could make out not only the soul, the heart of life, but also discern subtle differences in the hue of each, telling individual lives apart. And by virtue of this transcendent skill, he had often been likened to a denizen of the underworld. For a while he continued gazing up at the sky, watching the dance of ether alone with his thoughts, until the soft rustling of grass announced the approach of another. Noticing this, he shut his eyes tight as if to will the din away, but the steps only drew nearer, growing louder and louder, before finally becoming a voice overhead. "I heard the tidings. Congratulations, Hades. Or should I say the Honorable Emmett Selk of the Convocation of 14. If I pretend not to notice, perhaps he'll leave me in peace," he thought without much hope. And, as expected, but no less to his disappointment, the owner of the voice did not make to leave. Resigned, he grudgingly rolled over and heaved himself to his feet. Having repositioned his cowl, he addressed the grinning visitor with unconcealed displeasure. "There is naught to congratulate. I merely filled a void. One which, I would remind you, only existed because you refused the honor. Come now, it went to the candidate best suited to the office. You find practical use for that which you see, while I enjoy the seeing for its own sake. And what does that say about your suitability for your own office? Perhaps I shall raise the subject at the Hall of Rhetoric." As he said these words, he glared daggers through his mask, but the threat, idle as they both knew, served only to elicit a snort of amusement from the chief of the Bureau of the Architect, his close friend Hyphlodeus. Attired in a black robe and a white mask, the man looked entirely unremarkable, yet, like Hades, he was eminently gifted in the ability to behold the underworld. As a matter of fact, were it purely a question of vision, his was the keener of the two. Precious little escaped his eyes, which could discern essence and appearance as plainly as night and day. This made him amply qualified for the highest office of the Bureau of the Architect, the institution which oversaw the creation of concepts, and incurably smug. Irked by Hythlodaeus' unshaken good cheer, he snapped, "Was there something else?" and immediately regretted it when he saw the man's grin broaden. "As a matter of fact, yes. Have you informed a certain someone of your appointment?" "Hardly necessary. The memorandum will see to it, if the gossips in the street haven't already. News pertaining to the 14 is wont to spread quickly. Were you to ask my opinion, I would tell you such a momentous message warrants a personal delivery. Shall I ascertain our friend's whereabouts? It will take but a moment." "I did not ask for your opinion, nor less your help. I understand you have pressing tasks and would not keep you from them." For the first time since Hythlodaeus arrived, the grin faded from his lips, the tilt of the man's head all but asking how Hades could have known. And though he was certain he would regret answering the unspoken question, in the end he found himself yielding to the interminable silence. With a sigh, he continued, "A short while ago you received a visitor from the words of La Habrea. This invariably means you have been tasked with an inspection of considerable import, and by rights should not have time to spend in idleness. That you should seek me out at such a juncture suggests you have a consultation or, the mind boggles, a request." For a moment Hythlodaeus said nothing, as if mulling over the words. Then his shoulders began to shake with laughter. "You wound me, old friend. I merely chanced to notice you lying here and wished to offer my congratulations." As he continued, his voice took on an impish tone. "And I dare say, given your new responsibilities, you've even less time than me to spend in idleness. Of course, you were never one to rouse yourself, save when you deemed a matter worthy of your attention." Though said in jest, the uninvited observation did not improve his mood. "You have offered your congratulations," he said testily. "If there is naught else, I shall be on my way." Seeing him turn to leave, Hythlodaeus hastily changed his tone. "Wait. As you say, I have a consultation for you, and a request. Will you not hear me out, most eminent Emmett Selk?" "An immortal bird," Hades repeated as they made their way through the restricted area of the Bureau of the Architect. Hythlodaeus nodded. "To be precise, it's not a living being, but magic woven in the likeness of a bird, one possessed of puissant healing powers. And as befits a masterwork of the words of La Habrea, it is a thing of beauty." "I don't doubt it. So what then is the problem?" "As I said, it is not a living being. The concept proposed was a magic in avian guise. With this in mind," Hythlodaeus stretched out a hand to the enormous gate that stood before them. Soundlessly, the towering doors swung open, and Hades found himself wincing at the ear-rending cry that emanated from within. Furrowing his brow, he stepped across the threshold to be greeted with the sight of a magnificent bird, its plumes fairly afire, circling high in the vaulted hall. Having marked the creature's undeniable beauty, it took him but another moment to identify the problem, an unmistakable light shining in its heart. His breath caught in his throat. A soul? How? Through their mastery of creation magics, men could weave anything into existence. Anything they could imagine, they could bring forth. Anything, that is, except a soul. As Hades well knew, souls spontaneously manifested within creatures that were born in accordance with the laws of nature. It was a gift from the star itself, long held to be impossible to recreate. No artificial being, no matter how subtly sculpted in the image of nature, could come to possess a soul. Such creations occupied a separate classification known as arcane entities. "There was an accident," Hythlodaeus began. "During the concept's examination, a drifting soul merged with it, a soul burdened with regret judging by the being's behavior. It rages against the pull of the underworld." As he listened, Hades kept his gaze fixed on the creature, which flew about in a frenzy. No sooner would it dash itself against the wall in an explosion of broken feathers than it would heal itself and repeat the grisly feat. This self-destructive dance unfolded again and again, with the creature occasionally giving vent to its overflowing magical reserves, or fury as it seemed to him, as fiery breath. Witnessing the excruciating display, his thoughts poured forth unbidden from his lips. Consumed by the fear of death, it thrashes blindly about. It will know only pain and suffering and inflict the same upon others. A pitiful existence. Such moving empathy. It's as if you wore the feathers yourself. He waved a dismissive hand. Yes, but what do you intend to do with it? Masterwork or no, we cannot well leave it as it is." There Hythlodaeus turned to face him, that irritating smile having returned, and again he knew a pang of regret. As it is immortal after a fashion, we here have not the ability to return it to the underworld. Our efforts would only cause it pain. Nay, we require the services of a powerful mage, and I know of none more powerful than you." Once more he found himself glaring daggers at his friend, whose grin had become broader than ever. But rather than give him the satisfaction of a complaint, he decided that he would make a debt of it. Without another word, he focused his mind, and as he did, his silhouette wavered and danced. Then, all of a sudden, like a shadow lengthening, his form began to swell. Through the thrum of gathering ether, he heard Hythlodaeus remark, "Never ceases to impress me." He knew well what his friend beheld, the unbridled power of the underworld pouring forth into his being. In such moments he felt as if he was one with its flow. Though mages were plentiful, not even amongst the rest of the 14 could one find another capable of wielding such power. Ere long his transformation was complete, and Hythlodaeus was left to crane his neck up at him. "Indeed, there is no better candidate. Allow me to congratulate you again, Immortal." He let out a quiet breath, a sigh mingled with laughter. Then he faced the bird and set about his task. "Your Radiance! Your Radiance!" The voice rumbled from a distance, impatient and insistent. Drowsily he opened his eyes, and through the haze of sleep inadvertently focused upon the flow of ether, the habit of eons. Unlike eons ago, however, there was no brilliant shine to greet his sight, but a wan, sickly glow. A guttering candle where once a signal flame blazed. His face reflexively contorted in disgust. Gathering his scattered thoughts, he finally remembered where he was. Dozed off in the chair again. Ah, the joys of old age. "Your Radiance, it is the appointed hour." The voice rumbled from right before him. He cast a bleary gaze toward the sounds to see a young man, tall and strapping and golden-haired, regarding him anxiously. Though he was still well shy of his 20th name day, the crease which adorned his forehead added years to his grandson's appearance. This body's grandson, he corrected himself. Then he remembered. The boy, Varus, had been eager to report on his recent suppression of unrest in some forsaken province or other. Scarcely a matter warranting a formal audience, let alone rousing me for. Perhaps the boy had finally scraped together the courage to crow about his accomplishments. Perhaps he was put up to it by ambitious courtiers. Regardless, it was naught but the feeble plotting of malformed creatures. Warily he hauled himself to his feet and shuffled past the youth towards the door. He had barely taken half a dozen steps, however, when Varus found his tongue. "What is it about me that displeases you so?" He stopped at the unexpected address. Casting a glance over his shoulder, he saw the boy wearing an expression of pure anguish, and in that moment he looked every bit as young as he was. To let this question spill forth, his frustration towards his grandsire must be great indeed. After a moment's pause, he replied under his breath, "Your body." "What?" The boy's face was a picture of confusion, but he offered him not a word more, turning away and slowly taking his leave of the room. As he made his way to the audience chamber, a self-deprecating smile rose to his lips. Though Garleans are known for their large frames, the body he wore was by no means exceptional in that regard, nor was that of the woman he took for his wife. Yet their firstborn son was a prodigiously tall and robust specimen, unprecedented even among his kind. As the boy grew, his physique was held in awe and admiration by all, though to him it was a source of great vexation. In the end, they were all just malformed creatures, feeble, frail, and foolish, thrashing blindly about in their fleeting, fragmented lives, repeating the same mistakes over and over again. Never could they replace his brethren, yet in spite of himself, when he cradled the newborn in his arms and stroked that downy hair, he could not help but hope. For what, he could not be certain, but he hoped nonetheless. It made little difference in the end, for his son had succumbed to some absurd illness and returned to the underworld long before his time. Not without leaving behind a legacy, however, a living, breathing, and ever-present reminder of that momentary lapse. At length his frail body brought him to his destination. He paused before the door, took a deep breath, and shut his eyes tight, as if to will away the din. This is a tale of days long past, before the infernal light burned unrelentingly in the skies over Norvrant. In a chamber deep within the castle of Greenwich Licht, a young Numo peered intently into a flask, its contents illuminated by the moonlight that cascaded from the clerestory above. Beclug was one of very few of their kind here in Vobert, a nation dominated by the Drawn and the Galgant, by whose grudging alliance the kingdom had been formed. The youngsters' aptitude for all things arcane, however, was undeniable, and so it was that they were awarded the post of court mage, along with the use of this chamber, where they toiled day and night to unravel the mysteries of the soul. Though it was closer to dawn than dusk, Beklug gave no thought to sleep. It was at this late hour that Princess Paldea always came calling. The cheery drawn girl with a curious glint in her eye was fond of Beklug, whose retiring, reclusive nature could not have been more different from the fawning courtiers among whom she had grown up. And so she would come, time and again, to speak of every trifling thing that had caught her interest that day. This night, however, the princess offered no word of greeting, nor any other word for that matter. Sensing something was amiss, Beklug set down the flask and turned to see their guest's brow uncharacteristically furrowed. "Dear Pia, whatever is the matter?" Only the princess's closest acquaintances used the nickname, and she had always been pleased for Beklug to do so, yet she gave no sign of having heard her friend. "Don't tell me. It's that Saldia has inherited the 3 treasures, is it not?" "Yes, I too would be jealous were I in your place." The royal treasures of Vobert, 3 relics emblazoned with the mark of the 2-headed wolf, had been passed down for generations from ruler to anointed heir. The bequeathal ceremony, which had taken place a few days prior, officially recognized Paldea's elder sister as the next queen of the land. And while Beklug was not particularly well versed in the affairs of mortals, even they could imagine how this might affect the girl. Jealous? No, that's not it at all. I love my sister, and no one could be wiser or kinder or worthier of the throne than her. I want nothing more than to stay here and support her as I always have. But Father now talks of marriage. Looking at the poor child, her shoulders shaking and tears welling in her eyes, Beklug chided themselves inwardly. They had assumed from the tales of their brethren that all mortals, however unconsciously, coveted power and position, but they should have known that this one was different. Why else would she visit them of all people? Yet how were they to comfort her? Beklug had scarcely begun to ponder this conundrum when another visitor, a tall, slender drawn, draped in lavish white robes, strode airily into the chamber. Barely acknowledging Beklug, let alone begging leave to enter, the court mage Todrick made straight for the girl. "Oh, my poorest Princess Paldea," the mage began, dripping with affected sympathy. "No one feels your pain more than I. Yet you must understand His Grace's position. Only once you have been married into another family will the people come to accept your dear sister as the one and true queen." Though visibly taken aback at the sudden intrusion, the girl nonetheless answered quickly. "I know this, of course, and that Father only wants the best for his kingdom and his subjects. But what of his daughter?" "Oh, I quite agree, Your Highness," the mage oozed. "Fortunately, King Roderick is a wise and compassionate man. Could he but see the depths of your dismay, I have no doubt he would conclude that an unsought marriage will bring happiness to no one." Here he paused before adding, "As I should be only too glad to tell him, with your permission, of course." The princess blinked disbelievingly. "You would do that? For me?" "Thank you, Todrick. Thank you with all my heart." Her eyes brightening again, she gave Beklug a sideways glance and whispered, "Nice to see that someone understands me." Shoulders sagging, the Numo let out a weary sigh and returned to their solitary labors. Some days later, the princess came once more to Beklug's chamber to report that the matter had been settled. After hearing Todrick's plea on her behalf, the king had agreed to abandon plans for her betrothal. There was, however, one condition: that Paldea renounce her status as princess and serve instead as a court mage. "It is a position I would be only too glad to accept," she declared with a hint of longing, "had I any aptitude at all for magic. And so I come to you. You told me that you were studying the secrets of the soul, yes? That you believed there was a means by which the hidden talents that slumber within us might be unlocked." Averting their eyes so as to avoid the princess's pleading gaze, Beklug shook their head. "My research is far from complete, Pia. While it is true that I have developed an elixir which can safely stimulate one's dormant physical capabilities, awakening arcane talents is another matter entirely. The procedure would entail making irrevocable alterations to the subject's soul, which I could not in good conscience attempt without exhaustive and lengthy testing." Beklug did their best to explain the dangers. The soul was a complex and delicate thing, they said, and even the slightest misstep could do untold harm to a mortal body, or worse. But Princess Paldea would not relent. "I don't care. All I want is to stay here with my family. If I cannot meet Father's conditions, I'll be sent far away. We may never even see each other again." The girl's tone grew ever more impassioned as she continued, "Please, Beklug, you are the only one who can save me." Though they would not admit it, The young Numo shared her feelings. They had no desire to lose their best friend in that lonely castle, their only friend beyond their flasks and tomes. Besides, after all the kindness the princess had shown them in their time there, did they not owe her that much? After staring at the floor for a while and finding no help there, Begluk grudgingly nodded. The next day, Paldea's newfound powers were recognized by the king, and she proudly took her place among the finest mages of the court. Though her status had changed, Paldea's visits remained as frequent as ever. Listening to the girl breathlessly sharing the minutiae of her days, Begluk's lingering doubts about the powers they had bequeathed to her were gradually eased, and yet their heart was not entirely free of worry. Word has it that strange beasts have been appearing near Longmirror Lake of late. Promise me you'll take care of yourself, Pia. In the decades since King Roderick I had ascended to the throne, the kingdom of Vobert and his people had enjoyed a period of nigh uninterrupted peace. Yet this only served to make the news that a shepherd boy had been found butchered more shocking. The youth had reportedly fallen prey to a fearsome beast which had appeared as if from nowhere. Though the fiend was quickly dispatched by the royal knights, a similarly grisly incident followed some few days later, casting a pall over the city that would not be lifted. While it was initially assumed that the beast had wandered into the kingdom from parts unknown, further investigation uncovered a more disturbing truth. The beasts had in fact been sons and daughters of Vobert, whose bodies had undergone a ghastly transformation through the influence of some unholy power. This revelation plunged the kingdom into chaos, no one knowing when their neighbors or even their loved ones might metamorphose into bloodthirsty abominations. In the dark days that followed, it was Princess Saldea who arrived like a comet to pierce the nation's gloom. I told you no one was worthier of the throne. Paldea beamed as she raced into the room. Saldea now fights at the vanguard in our battle against the monsters. The girl had every reason to be proud of her sister. Relations between Vobert's knights and his court mages had always been strained at best and outright hostile at worst. And yet Crown Princess Saldea had managed to unite them under her leadership, assembling a fighting force blessed with enough might and magic to put down each threat as soon as it arose. Though the cause of the ghastly phenomenon remained a mystery, the crisis had at the very least been contained. Back at the castle, however, the matter weighed heavy on Begluk's heart, privy as they were to a terrible secret, that the methods they had revealed to Paldea in her hour of need might in theory at least turn mortals into monsters. But could she stoop so low? No, the Numo shook their head, comforting themselves that it would never so much as occur to the pure-hearted girl to use the knowledge they had shared in such a way. And so they returned to their studies, hopeful that the worst was past. Alas, it was not long before news arrived to give the lie to that hope. Crown Princess Saldea had been wounded on the front lines, failed, it was said, by one of her knights, who had since been expelled from the guard in disgrace. Faced with such distressing tidings, Begluk could only seek solace in their research, engrossing themselves ever more deeply in their work. Whatever was behind all this, it was none of their concern. Sooner or later, the culprit would be found and forced to answer for these odious acts. The world had a way of balancing itself out, and this time would be no exception. Everything would be all right in the end. How many moons had passed since then? Their every waking hour consumed by their studies, Begluk could scarcely say. That night too, they were peering intently into a flask when the door to their study flew open and someone raced into the room. Turning around with a start, their gaze was met by none other than Su'ul, a fellow Numo who served as a steward to the king. Begluk, at last we have unmasked the villain behind these infernal transformations. Begluk suppressed a gasp. This was the moment they had been waiting for, but also the one they had dreaded. They did their best to appear impassive as Su'ul continued. It was that fiend Tadrik. A band of adventurers as good as caught him in the act. Begluk breathed a sigh of relief, knowing now beyond a shadow of a doubt that their dear Paldea was innocent. I will be joining the adventurers to hunt the traitor down and bring him to justice, but monsters swarm the grounds even as we speak. You must lock yourself in here until the danger has passed. Their warning delivered, Su'ul made to leave, but Begluk called after them. Wait, where is Pia? Where is Paldea? Rest easy, the older Numo replied firmly. She is safe in her chambers, and I have arranged for one of the adventurers to keep watch over her. And with that, I must go. Yet Begluk could not rest easy. They had met with the adventurers of whom Su'ul had spoken, and while they seemed an eminently capable bunch, one Begluk had been happy to assist, they were nonetheless strangers to the land, and Paldea's life was at stake. Panic gripping their heart, they dashed out of their study, hells bent on preventing their best and only friend from coming to harm. But Begluk was a scholar, not a fighter, and with monsters lurking around every corner, they could do little save scuttle between the shadows. Despite their best efforts, however, they soon found themselves face to face with a slavering beast. Mercy, they croaked aghast. Out of the way, you stupid mutt. The silver-haired swordswoman was in front of them before Beck-Luke knew she was there, plunging her blade into the hideous creature, which seemed every bit as shocked as its prey. After watching it slump lifeless to the ground, the elf cast a cold glance at the cowering figure at her feet, then raced down the hall without so much as another word. If Beck-Luke was not mistaken, she was one of Ardbert's companions, which meant she may be the self-same adventurer to whom Su'ol had entrusted Paldea's care. Instantly forgetting the umbrage they had taken at being likened to a dog, they set off after the woman as fast as their legs could carry them, coming upon her just as she was kicking down the door to Paldea's private chambers. "How dare you!" Beck-Luke screamed, barging past the adventurer in search of their friend. And there she was. Beck-Luke stood frozen. From behind them, the swordswoman advanced, her blade drawn. Too late, it would seem. All we could do now is put her out of her misery. The sight of the elf's blood-stained blade was enough to shake Beck-Luke from their reverie. "No! Have mercy on the girl, I beseech you!" "Are you mad?" the woman spat back. "Look at her arm, it's already begun." Beck-Luke knew in their heart that the adventurer was right, yet they did not yield. They could not stand idly by and let their best friend, however hopeless her plight, be slaughtered before their eyes. "Please, I have studied the secrets of the soul. I may very well be able to save her. You must spare her life. You must." It was a lie, of course. The process, once begun, was quite irreversible, yet they had to try. The adventurer gave the pneumo fairly clinging to her leg a searching look, then let out a sigh. "This castle has a guile, yes?" Cursing all the while, the silver-haired swordswoman knocked Paldea unconscious and carried her down to the dungeons with Beck-Luke muttering directions. No sooner had she locked the door than she took to her heels, doubtless eager to join her companions in their search for the traitorous Todrick. Beck-Luke, for their part, sat still as stone in front of the cell, waiting for their friend to awaken. And when at last she did, it was with words unlike any they had heard her speak before. "Hells take you, Todrick," the girl seethed, her voice a feral snarl. "You promised me you would bury my sister and make me queen. I tricked that dog into divulging the secrets you craved, and you betrayed me." It was as if the girl could not see the friend of whom she spoke sitting there right before her eyes. Clawing at her skin, she began to draw up the dungeon walls with glyphs in her own blood. "Wretched sister! Were it not for you, I could have lived in happiness with my family forever. Curse you, Saldea! Curse your rotten soul!" Beck-Luke had sat agog throughout the whole tirade, but at this they found their voice once more. "Enough, Pia! Is your sister not part of the family you hold so dear? How many times did you tell me how much you loved and admired her?" Slowly the girl turned. Peering into her widened eyes, Beck-Luke could see a dawning realization, as if she were only now remembering things long forgotten. You are right. I love father, and mother, and my sister too. Why what have I done?" As the words left her lips, she slumped forward, a shadowy mist beginning to seep from her body before dissipating into the air. In that moment, Beck-Luke saw the truth, that Todrick had bound the poor girl's heart with dark magics and forced her to do his bidding. "Forgive me, Beck-Luke, my friend." A tear tumbled from her cheek and struck the dank stone floor. When at length she raised her head, Beck-Luke saw that the curious glint in her eye had been extinguished. Only despair remained there, a stare, a wordless cry for mercy. Before the vesper bell tolled that day, Beck-Luke left the castle, never to return. And though Ardbert and his fellows succeeded in apprehending the architect of these tragedies, they could not save Saldea from one final act of spite. Thus was the proud kingdom of Vobert robbed of its heir and condemned to an age of decline. When the flood came, it was a shadow of its former glory, all but powerless to defend itself against the sin-eater hordes. And so did the kingdom fall, and fall for good. It is claimed that poor Paldea was still in her cell on the day Grennis Lick was finally abandoned. As for what became of the ill-starred princess after that, neither Beck-Luke nor anyone can say. Amuro, in whom the old blood is quickened, have a lifespan far exceeding that of their unawakened kin. Yet even these long-lived specimens are not spared the ravages of time. Eyes become clouded, wings grow feeble and frail, and in the case of the hulking Seto, leader of the Walkerdorf Amuro, old age has brought with it an ever-growing desire to doze, as if the combined weight of more than 100 winters were bearing down upon his eyelids. This day is no different. The venerable creature surrenders to the siren call of sleep as the sweet scent of flowers fills his nostrils, his mind's eyes soon flickering with visions of a warmly remembered past. A young Amuro, emaciated and exhausted, stretched himself flat in a sun-baked corner of the city of Nabatharang. One glance at the pitiful creature told a story of protracted abuse of a body beaten and deprived of anything beyond the bare essentials required for survival. No man nor beast would willingly choose those searing flagstones for a bed, but the bulky wagon to which the Amuro was harnessed afforded him little choice in the matter. So here he would lie, conserving his strength until his owner returned to rouse him. Ah, the master has returned. A corpulent Hume emerged from a nearby stone-built shopfront and strode purposefully towards the wagon, a cruel-looking whip gripped tightly in his sausage-like fingers. Crafted from the elastic sinews of a lizard, the lash delivered a terrible sting which the Amuro knew only too well. Even if fatigued to a point of collapse, when the whip spoke, he somehow found the will to answer. It comes. Would it be the neck or the shoulder? The back or the rump? The Amuro hoped it would miss his snout, scrunching his eyes shut in anticipation of that agonizing snap which preceded every journey. But it never came. Confused, the Amuro opened his eyes to see a young man standing directly between him and the scourge of his days. The stranger seemed scarcely out of boyhood, yet he balanced an oversized great axe upon one shoulder with apparent ease. Surrender yourself, Lamont. The Jade Fox has been unmasked. Thus did the Amuro first meet Ardbert, the man who would later name him Seto. It was an encounter which would, in the fullness of time, blossom into a true and lasting friendship. The seed for this roadside confrontation had, in fact, been sown several moons earlier with the discovery of fake gemstones in the markets of Nabatharang. Of such cunning artifice were the jewels that even the most practiced appraisers had been taken in by their seeming perfection. Pride stung and reputation in tatters, the members of the Jewelers Guild had offered a bounty of staggering riches for the capture of the Jade Fox, as the mystery counterfeiter had come to be known. Word soon spread, and would-be bounty hunters from across the land had converged upon the city in a mad scramble to claim the reward. Yet despite their best efforts to sniff out the fox, they succeeded only in uncovering still more of the counterfeiter's fabrications. It was a pair of novice adventurers, Ardbert and Lamit, who finally brought the Jade Fox to justice. They had enlisted the aid of Brandon, once a knight of Vobert, and with his help pierced the intricate veil of illusory magic placed upon the forgeries. Thus laid bare, the bauble's origins could begin to be deduced, the evidence leading them at last to a man by the name of Lamont. Upon collecting the bounty from the grateful jewelers, the three agreed to split the lavish purse equally. Yet recalling Brandon's not inconsiderable thirst for revelry, the other two had expressed reservations about awarding him his share all at once. They knew as well as he did that the whole lot might be drunk in the space of a night, and so he had grudgingly accepted Lamit's proposal to spread the spoils over a period of moons, even if it did mean joining them on the road for a while. Ardbert, for his part, had his own plans for this newfound fortune. Learning that the authorities had taken possession of Lamont's maltreated Amuro, he wasted no time in negotiating a price for the creature. The Amuro meekly tottered along behind his liberator until they reached the party's lodging, whereupon he immediately collapsed into a listless heap. "What were you thinking, boy?" Brandon quipped. "The beast's all skin and bones. I doubt he could survive a turn around the city, let alone a trip across the desert. Or there's not enough meat on him for a bowl full of stew." The Amuro snorted loudly as if taking umbrage at the insult. "Don't listen to that lout, Seto," Ardbert said warmly, scratching the underside of the Amuro's jaw. "I'd sooner see him in a pot than you, and we'll show him your true value soon enough." In fairness to the knight, the city officials had shared Brandon's low opinion of Seto. They deemed the weakened creature a worthless investment, and what Ardbert knew, have soon put him out of his misery. Unable to bear the thought, the young man had been moved to act. It was simple compassion which drove him, yet there was also curiosity, for in the piteous creature's demeanor, he swore he had glimpsed a spark of something more. Born on a small isle in the seas of Kalusha, Ardbert had spent his childhood amongst the birds and the beasts, there being no others of his age to play with in the mountain village he called home. It was there that his father, the boy's only living relative, had instructed him in the care of all manner of livestock. This education included the habits of the noble Amuro, and thus Seto's unusual behavior had instantly piqued Ardbert's interest. He had watched the poor creature bide his time, waiting until his cruel master had departed before sinking down to rest, in what appeared to be a deliberate bid to escape further punishment. and such rare intelligence was a thing to be nurtured. Time to earn your keep, Seto. At a whistle from Ardbert, the Amuro trotted further out into the fields of amber and flopped heavily to the ground. Ardbert, meanwhile, quickly ducked behind a boulder, taking his place alongside the crouched figures of Brandon and Lamit. Local merchants had hired them to slay a vicious pack of coyotes that threatened the caravan route, and a bewildered Seto was playing the role of bait. "Still not much of a meal, is he?" Brandon muttered, his bulky frame folded double in an awkward effort to remain unseen. "I hope those beasts are hungry." Dimly aware of the larger man's grumbling, Seto mused over his recent change in circumstances. Unlike his old master, Ardbert never struck or beat him, and he always made certain Seto had plenty to eat and drink. He had even brushed the filth from his feathers. Ardbert's touch was kind, and when he scratched that spot beneath Seto's jaw, the Amuro almost felt like purring. It was an unfamiliar feeling. Then there were the tricks. Seto was mystified as to their purpose, but not wanting to anger his new owner and risk everything he'd gained, he did his best to perform as Ardbert directed, and now it seemed he was to be sacrificed. I should have known. Men are all the same. As he lay there despondent, resigned to his fate, Seto spotted the pack of coyotes approaching at an easy lope and realized why he had been fed so well. "Seto, to me!" Great axe raised, Ardbert came charging in his direction. Seto tilted his head in momentary confusion, then sprang to his feet. Concluding that he had not been left to die after all, he set off towards his new master as fast as his legs would carry him. And though he was unable to take flight, his body having yet to recover from years of malnourishment, he flapped his wings with frantic strength all the same. The predators duly took up the chase, and the sight of the earthbound Amuro scrambling along in a blind panic had Brandon in tears of laughter. "Ha! The scrawny rascal can move when it suits him." Bridling at the knight's mocking tone, Seto changed course. A dozen yalms short of his onrushing master, the Amuro hopped high into the air and glided straight over Brandon's head. Moments later, the coyotes, which had been snapping at the Amuro's tail, were now snarling in the big man's face. "What? Ah!" Brandon yelped, his smirk evaporating as he brought his shield up just in time. Thus did the adventurers draw in their quarry and put them to the sword. They would go on to complete many such tasks, with the mark's nature dictating how Seto would play his part. A feeble cry for the ravenous, a mighty roar for the territorial. The true range of the Amuro's acting skills would only become apparent much later, however, during the hunt for the Amber Terror, a predatory bird of nightmarish size known to haunt the hills of Amber. Even Ardbert was astonished to hear Seto mimic the mating call of a female forest raucous, his near-perfect cries serving to lure out their otherwise elusive prey. Wounded in the initial charge, the terror chose to flee, and the adventurers were compelled to give chase, eventually cornering the monster in its nest and bringing it down amidst a frenzy of scything talons. "Would you look at that?" exclaimed a panting Lamit who, even in the fierce heat of the fields, refused to doff her dwarven helmet. It had its very own treasure trove. True enough, atop the bed of dried grass sat a haphazard pile of glinting trinkets. Well, well, well. I'd heard these birds had a fondness for shiny things. Brandon's eyes sparkled as he reached down and plucked a saucer-sized medallion from the heap. He held it aloft and the heavy disc flashed like a second sun at midday. "Now this is a find," he crowed. "Naboth royalty would award such tokens to victorious generals. It must be over 200 years old, which means the terror must have taken it from a descendant, or dug up a grave." The knight grinned hugely. Either way, it will fetch a handsome price from the right collector. As he moved to tuck the prize in his pouch, Ardbert shot out a hand and snatched the medallion away. "Not so fast," the younger man snapped with a grin of his own. "This medal should go to the one who earned it." "Is that so?" Brandon replied unabashed. "Then you best give it back. Who shielded you all from that axe of a beak? Who delivered the killing blow to that monster's neck?" "Why, you, old friend, and fine deeds they were. But you wouldn't have had the chance to do either had Seto not lured the terror out of hiding in the first place." Ardbert rummaged through his pack for a moment, then produced a narrow leather strap. This he threaded through the medallion's eye before hanging the trophy around Seto's neck. "For a comrade brave and true." The Amuro snorted loudly and held his head high. "You'll hear no argument from me," chuckled Lamit. "I'd rather see Seto get his due than watch Brandon drink another tavern dry." "Nah, have it your way," Brandon exclaimed, throwing his hands up in surrender. "3 cheers for Seto, the wiliest Amuro that ever lived." Lighthearted though it was, Ardbert's gesture that day served to recognize Seto as an equal, a full partner in the band's growing list of accomplishments. Such was their success, in fact, that they were approached soon after by one Renda Ray, a seasoned hunter who wished to join the party renowned throughout Amarang as the Bane of Beasts. Later in Lakeland, they would enlist the sword of the silver-haired Silva while delving into the mystery of a missing daughter of noble lineage. And back in Amarang, their ranks would swell once more with the addition of the redoubtable mage Naubert, who had until then been their rival. Together they traveled, together they fought, together they suffered. Plentiful were their hardships, yet for Seto, the joys of their journey far outweighed the sorrows. Awakening from his nap, the elderly Amuro breathes a small, contented sigh at the weight of the medallion around his neck. It had been lost to him once. He had been defending the settlement from stray sin-eaters when the leather strap, stretched taut by a neck grown twice as broad, suddenly snapped, sending the golden disc tumbling into the black depths of the lake. How kind of the traveler to retrieve it for him. It was at his request that the pixies of Lita Laran had crafted the strap from which the medallion now swings, imbuing it with a dreamer's charm in so doing, if he is any judge. How else could one account for the remarkable clarity and frequency of these slumbering sojourns to the sun-dappled past? Suddenly he is seized by the urge to travel, to soar. Perhaps he cannot compass the realm as once he did, not with these aging bones, but a jaunt to the far shore of the lake should not be beyond him. He would visit the one they called the Weaver, and thank them for this gift, for these blessed dreams. The Amuro stands and unfurls his wings, stretching them out to catch the breeze. Old though he may be, he will remember how it feels to fly again. Emmett Selk. My name rang out in the capital, the caller's voice resounding around the foyer. I could hardly pretend not to have heard, alas, and thus turned to face my pursuer. I had been so close to escaping. The voice belonged, as I knew it would, to a white-robed youth of small stature, who was hastening across the hall. His red mask marked him out as one of the convocation of 14, Elidibus. I fixed him with an inquiring look as he recovered his breath. When at last he spoke, it was, as ever, in earnest. Do you know of the volcano we'll be discussing at the next session? I know that we are due for some pyrotechnics. According to reports circulated around the convocation, there had been unusual ethereal activity on an isolated volcanic isle, which is to say, an eruption was forthcoming. The island had one village upon it, and a wealth of fertile farmland, all of which would soon be lost. But that was simply the way of the world. As in many such cases, our role was merely to acknowledge the fact. The islanders would do the same, and those who deemed it prudent had likely already begun to move elsewhere. While it was true that the convocation intended to discuss the matter, the conclusion would be no less inevitable. But then why had Elidibus approached me? Well, Azim went there, and is resolved to stop the eruption. Naturally, I felt my brow furrowing and fought to suppress a scowl that threatened to pull my forehead down over my eyes. How? I eventually managed. You have heard of Ifrita, yes? The fire spirit? La Habrea's masterwork, an impressive concept even for him. It truly is incredible, the youth said with quiet fervency, the determined line of his lips curving into a grin. Generally, I found his ardent admiration for the rest of the council endearing, if embarrassing, but at that moment, I was rather preoccupied with the implications of his suggestion. It's a wonder my brow ever recovered. Ifrita, a manifestation of concentrated fire ether. I could see what Azim was planning. Transform the volcano's ether into Ifrita, draw her away, and then destroy her elsewhere. This would safely disperse the excess. Of course, the plan required someone to procure the concept of Ifrita for Azim. But if that someone was not La Habrea himself, who else could it be? As everyone knew, concepts were stored in the Bureau of the Architect, and not all could be readily removed for personal use. The chief of the Bureau, however, could grant access as he pleased. Who else indeed? I pictured my friend cheerily sending Azim off to battle without a second thought. Forgetting my mask, I clapped my palm to my forehead in exasperation, which Elidibus duly took as a sign that I understood. If things get out of hand, Azim could be censured again, and here the youth paused. But I'm sure that won't happen, not with your help. My brow resumed its descent. Very well, but are you certain it is wise for the emissary to ally himself with so divisive a figure? Oh, I'm not, he replied with practiced deftness. I'm simply giving Azim's opinion on the matter equal weight. The rest of the 14 have yet to reach a verdict after all. On this point I could not argue, though I wasn't particularly inclined to agree. And so I shrugged, musing inwardly that Azim was lucky the current emissary was such a kindly soul. Before we parted ways, however, I couldn't resist asking one more question. Did you happen to find out why Azim is so keen on preventing this eruption?" The youth frowned, inevitably striving to recall his conversation with Azim as accurately as possible. It wouldn't do for the emissary to speak unadvisedly, after all. I waited politely. "If I recall correctly," he began at length, with the air of one about to reveal a grave truth, "the grapes grown on that isle are particularly delicious, or so Azim said. They must be truly remarkable." Indeed. I couldn't bring myself to shatter his faith. I did, however, vow to treat my friends to a lecture on priorities. Blissfully ignorant of my misgivings, the young man smiled to himself again and bade me farewell. As he wandered away, I swore I heard him murmur something about Azim's ever-refreshing perspective. That's the sort of person Elidibus was, eager to fulfill his duty. He also respected and admired the convocation more than any other. To many of us, he was as a younger brother of sorts, and when it became clear that he was the most suitable candidate for Zodiark's heart, it mattered not how strong our resolve. There was none among us who did not waver. Could there have been any greater shock then than our subsequent reunion? This was soon after Zodiark became the will of the star, and our final days were averted. The people were divided, unable to decide what to do with the future that now stretched out before them. Many wished to trade the new life which had sprung forth to reclaim those lost in the sacrifice to Zodiark. No small number, however, insisted that the fate of our world should be entrusted to those self-same freshly minted souls. All were at our wits' end. At once we saw it shimmering. It poured out of Zodiark's breast and resolved into the shape of a man. As he looked us over, mouths agape no doubt, he gave what passed for an earnest smile. "Fear not, you will make the right choice, and I will see it through." How long had passed since then I did not care to remember. In any case, my role as Solus Zosgalvis, founder of an empire, had concluded, and I was drifting. I thought I might settle down for a nice peaceful nap in the rift for a century or so. It would serve to rinse away the cloying residue of Solus, whose body I had left back in the source. One should not remain perpetually in character. Not that there was much point in me retaining my sense of self. I had thought more than once that it would be easier simply to have done with it and discard my real form altogether. Yet given the state of the other two unsundered, some part of me was convinced that if I remained stubborn, a reason more compelling than hollow sentiment would come along eventually. Emmett Selk. My name rang out in the darkness, tugging me back to consciousness. Again, I elected to ignore the disturbance, but the voice was persistent. Once more it called, closer now. Though the voice was the same as the one which had ambushed me in the capital so long ago, it sounded as if it belonged to another person entirely. Perhaps it did. La Habrea is gone, the voice said softly. I could hardly continue to feign slumber at that, so I righted myself and turned to face Elidibus. The silence that stretched between us then only affirmed the truth that had gone unspoken. For us, death was not the end, but gone. We knew this day would come. I closed my eyes, letting out a measured breath, or what passed for one in the emptiness of the rift. He was right, of course. La Habrea's boldness had only grown with the passing of ages, segueing inevitably into recklessness. Across many vessels and many worlds he blazed his trail, each mad leap forward leaving him that much more broken. Not satisfied with having brought about the seventh umbral calamity, he labored needlessly to prolong it. Was it his affinity for concepts of flame that made him so like the fire itself? From peerless Ifrita to that hopeless immortal bird, his creations had burned bright and beautiful, as did he. He should have known what becomes of the flame once all else is ash. I opened my eyes to take in my brother's face, but the lips visible below his mask bore no expression. Would he never again show what he felt for us, as he once had so readily? Were those very sentiments long lost? What is it, Emmett Selk? Nothing. I was only thinking how similar La Habrea was to his creations. His creations? I had little difficulty reading Elidibus's uncertainty this time. He couldn't remember. If his clenched fist were any indication, he shared my conclusion, yet another part of him had been lost. Ever since the day he had reappeared to us as the embodiment of hope, time's tides had conspired to wash away what bits and pieces remained of the person he once was. Will you not look at your crystal? I asked. When Elidibus was still Elidibus and La Habrea still La Habrea, we had collected all of our memories of the 14 and committed them to crystal, that those who would take our seats one day might learn. Elidibus would, I was sure, find much within to help him remember, yet he shook his head. I am Elidibus. So long as I remember my duty, that is enough. Aught else I would only lose again in the course of this timeless struggle. and if these memories are truly so precious, pray do not ask that I forget them twice. On this point too I couldn't argue, though again I could hardly agree. As he was now, however, I doubted that Elidibus could tell my shrug was affected. I make for the source, to put an end to the one who laid La Habrea low, he said as teleportation magics began to roil around him. Sounds like a real hero. No match for you, in other words. We must always prepare for the worst. If we are to succeed, you must resume your efforts as well. I was half inclined to tell him I preferred to sleep, but of course he was already gone, leaving me alone in the darkness. That was the last time I ever saw Elidibus. And now my charms are all overthrown, and what strength I have is mine own, which is most faint as is my breath, that quavers here at brink of death. 'Twas ere my fate to wager all, for that which wrought my brother's fall, and thus the ether beckons me, to depths of black eternity, to dream of things long lost and gone, and futures which might yet be won. Though not by me, lest you mistake, for others wait the stage to take, and while their worth is far from sure, I bid the farewell curtain. Let encore be my final word, their epilogue to death preferred. When one looks upon the chronicles of history, those immovable tomes of ages past, one is certain to find the mark of a great many notable figures. Conquerors, pioneers, heroes, men and women whose lives served to punctuate the endless passage of time. I am not one of them. No builder of nations me, nor less a savior of the oppressed. I am but a humble engineer who had the good fortune to become the 18th president of Garland Iron Works. For 200 years now, we have kept alive the dream of freedom through technology, passing on the legacy of our predecessors to the next incumbent upon our retirement, save for one poor fellow who died after 3 days in the role. In the end, however, the only name history will remember is that of Sid Garland, our own appearing as mere footnotes to his legend. A legend we are only too happy to preserve. Garland Iron Works' first home was a workshop in Revenant's Toll, and I am told there was a time when people would flock from every corner of the realm to gaze upon its wonders. A stark contrast to our present operation. Our base now sits nestled in what remains of the Keeper of the Lake, a monument which both time and necessity have done much to diminish, a legion of scavengers having taken their pick of what the elements saw fit to spare. Indeed, the site is in utter shambles, and yet I can think of no better place for us to have set up shop. The surrounding lake serves as a natural obstacle to intruders, and the dragon whose sinuous frame still holds the whole hulking heap together is said to have shared a storied history with an old friend of the founder. In short, a site as apt as it is inaccessible. It was there that our engineers and some few volunteers were enjoying a hard-earned rest. After several sleepless nights, work in the Crystal Tower was at last complete, and on the morrow it would be transported across time and space to another world, the first. Meager though our resources were, we had laid on a veritable feast to commemorate the occasion, and one and all had enjoyed the much-needed respite to the fullest. Indeed, many had reveled to exhaustion, choosing to sleep where they fell on the meeting hall floor. Though I too should have been counting sheep, my mind was busy enumerating reasons to stay awake, which were, it assured me, many. And so I sat there, staring into the fire. Thankfully, I was not without company. I've always wondered, I began, turning to regard my fellow insomniac. His crimson eyes seemed to glow in the firelight. A gift from the blood of Allegan royalty, he called them. A gift by which the Crystal Tower had borne him to us. In the morning, he would make another journey, this time bearing all our hopes and dreams for a better tomorrow with him. And though he had assured us it was a mission he gladly accepted, I could scarcely imagine the weight of that burden. There was so much I wished to tell him, but I put it aside to first ask a question that had long been burning in the back of my mind. Why did you do it? Why did you stay behind in the Crystal Tower? He blinked at me in disbelief before letting out a curt sigh. You would ask me this now. Would you rather I ask you on the morrow? I replied with a rather forced grin. I understand you were the only one who could have done it, and hindsight has shown it to be the right choice. Were it not for you, our dreams would be just that. But you couldn't have known that at the time, not for sure. What if we had never opened the tower? What a relief it was to finally speak the words aloud. I feared he would take them as little more than idle banter, but the thoughtful swishing of his tail suggested otherwise as he returned his gaze to the fire. An age seemed to pass as we sat there in silence, but I knew my wait for an answer was over when a faint smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. It occurred to me then that he hadn't been gazing into the fire, but through it, at something far brighter. I would have slept for all eternity, he laughed, which would, if nothing else, have been ironic. For it was only as the gates of the tower were closing behind me that I realized what it meant to awaken to one's true purpose. Go on. In those days, I could but dream of being counted with the likes of Sid, Nero, Biggs, and Wedge. Indeed, I would still give my right arm to achieve half of what they achieved. He proceeded to paint a picture of our forebears as paragons of invention, able to race from concept to product in the time it would take him to put on his boots. And then he spoke of his mentor Rambros, head of the Sons of St. Cornac, and of his pride at having been chosen to take part in the expedition to the Crystal Tower. He told me that the mission had taken a most unexpected turn when their party was joined by a pair of scholars named Doga and Unai, whom they later discovered to be clones born of Allegan technology, which had lain dormant within the tower for millennia. Apparently, when the structure was unearthed in the chaos of the seventh umbral calamity, the horrors within had awoken, prompting the pair to seek the aid of Grahatia and his companions in thwarting the dark designs of the tower's creator, one Emperor Zand. What began as a simple quest for knowledge thus became a grueling climb to the top of the tower, culminating in a battle with darkness itself. Yet far from laying claim to these feats, he was careful at every stage to recall the pivotal role played by the greatest hero of the age, one immortalized in song and script and remembered to this very day. Before me stood the very embodiment of heroism, the fables of my childhood made flesh, and in the light of so shining an example, I saw at last the part I had to play. How could I do aught but remain in the tower? Quite easily, I chuckled, were you and your exemplar not cut from the same cloth. Being of a rather less heroic disposition, however, I can tell you that my first act, having endured such an ordeal, would have been to go home to bed. But tell me, were you not scared? Of course I was, but courage is not the absence of fear. He leaned back then to stare up at the ceiling. It is the triumph over it. The roof, I should probably mention, was in the process of being repaired, and not without the odd gap. Clear nights offered small glimpses of the stars twinkling in the sky, and Grahatia seemed entranced by them as he continued to regale me with memories of days long past. So long as we were together, whatever foe stood against us, whatever twist of fate conspired to undermine us, I believed with all my heart that there was nothing we could not do. I went to speak, but when I glimpsed him gazing up at the heavens, his eyes full of steely resolve, I could only smile and wonder at what a fascinating life he led, at how a single individual could affect the fates of so many. Grahatia, Sid, my grandfather, and the countless others who had given their all to see our plan come to fruition. Would the Warrior of Light have believed that so many lives could be changed? Or what inspiration others could take from so tragically foreshortened a tale? Whatever the answer, the hopes and dreams we had labored so long to keep alive would soon be realized. Even to think about it made my heart skip a beat. I cleared my throat. And we have to keep believing, for a brighter future. I proffered my hand in our customary manner, and Grahatia returned the gesture. That we do, my friend. That we do. The following morning, the hour of his departure came at last. We stood upon the precipice of an unknown future, contemplating the promise of a tomorrow we would never see. Yet still we prayed, that our sacrifices had indeed sown the seeds of a better tomorrow, that at journey's end, our departing friend might reap that joyous harvest too. We prayed as the crystal tower stirred to life and vanished in a blinding flash of light. I can't say for how long we stood there at the shore of Silvertear Lake. It wasn't until the sun broke the horizon that I noted the passage of time and the deafening silence. We could only assume Grahatia's mission would carry on across the rift and that we had played our part to its completion. Yet with our duty done, I couldn't help but feel a part of me was missing, much like the crystal tower from the skyline of Mordona. I told myself that the void would soon be filled by a sense of accomplishment, but I wasn't sure I believed it. For 200 years we had toiled and struggled, and our efforts had been met not with thunderous applause, but the languid lapping of the lake. In the end, it was one of my companions who gave voice to the question on all of our minds. Will we be disappearing too then? I would be lying if I said we understood the ramifications of altering history. In the selfsame instant the tower had disappeared, it was quite possible we could have been erased from existence. Yet there we remained, and while that came as something of a relief, it brought with it the unwelcome suspicion that Graha had failed in his mission. Conscious that others were watching, I shook my head. Causality be damned. I refused to believe our friend would allow our travails to be for naught. The 8th umbral calamity had been averted, if not for us, then in a divergent timeline. Unbeknown to me, the others were busy reaching the same conclusion, and a laugh escaped the lips of someone in the crowd. Though the world yet remained in ruin, it was ours. A comforting, even comical thought considering what very well could have come to pass. Expunction from the pages of history no longer seeming to be in prospect, we enjoyed a moment of solace. Our forebears had overcome a great many trials that we might live to see that day, gaining control of the Crystal Tower, taming the wings of time, even harnessing the forces of the Rift, and we were not about to let the event pass unmarked. Our moment of solace lasted exactly as long as it took the earth to begin shaking. Plucked from our reverie, we frantically scanned our surroundings, hoping to find the source of the tremors, even as someone cried, "Over there!" We followed his gaze toward the keeper of the lake, and what we saw there left us speechless. The wreckage we dared to call home was collapsing. Steel plating creaked and groaned in protest as it broke apart before disappearing beneath the water. Unbidden, the image of the rickety roof came guiltily to mind, and I wondered if we had been too lax in our renovations. Then the whole pile began to move. The serpentine frame wrapped around the ship was breathing, writhing, breaking free of its resting place. "By the gods," a voice shrieked from the crowd, "Midgardsormr lives!" Our panic was soon drowned out by a deafening roar that all but shattered the heavens. My ears still ringing, I looked up to see that Midgardsormr had taken to the sky. After circling the lake, he bent his course towards us. No one dared move, nor even speak. We could only watch in horror as he made his approach. The engineer in me demanded to know why the great worm had chosen that moment to awaken, and I duly recalled the crystal tower-shaped gap on the horizon. Its departure had doubtless disturbed his rest. My blood ran cold at the thought of what might happen next, but my doom-laden musings were soon interrupted by a low, rumbling voice. "The tower. Is this your doing, children of man?" "1,000 apologies," I croaked. "We didn't mean to wake you." An agonizing silence followed. Before I knew it, my clenched fist was slippery with sweat. I tried telling myself I had nothing to fear, that the dragon had been a friend to Sid Garland and the others once upon a time, but try as I might, I could not escape the feeling that I was about to be incinerated. The worm grunted. "Long have I waited, watched as the world was shaped by your hand. Through war and calamity have I seen you struggle, devoting your fleeting lives to a dream you will never see." For an instant I contemplated pleading our case, but he spared me that embarrassment. Such constancy in creatures so inconsistent is impressive. Midgardsormr loomed closer then, his eyes fixed on a young girl and the plaything in her hands. I felt my stomach drop as I recognized it as my grandfather's Omega replica. Old as it was, my colleagues jokingly referred to it as a senior member of the Ironworks, and its age was certainly beginning to show. It randomly shut off however often we replaced its power core, and faulty sensors ensured it haphazardly bumped into everyone and everything, including Midgardsormr himself when his body still served as one of the walls of our workshop. In all honesty, building a new replica would have been less troublesome than fixing it. Yet we had agreed that such niceties should wait until after work on the Crystal Tower was finished. I cursed myself for not having stripped the infernal thing for scrap. Tilting his head down further to regard the faltering automaton, Midgardsormr made a most unusual sound, and though I knew nothing of dragons, I was almost certain it was a laugh. Recognizing the worm's amusement, the trepidation I had felt but moments before vanished in an instant. My blood was racing, and I could feel an unfamiliar heat welling up within me. Suddenly I remembered Grahatia's words from the previous night. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is the triumph over it. Gathering my wits, I began to realize that Midgardsormr's presence was not frightening, but exciting, that his choice to appear before us at that of all moments was an omen of much needed change. His eyes shifted to regard me then, and I found the courage to return his unblinking gaze. "Tell me, child of man, what dost thou see at dream's end?" "I see..." In my mind's eye, I glimpsed a world where the 8th Umbral calamity had never come to pass, where Eorzea's champion bestrode the realm, unbroken. But just as suddenly, I saw that this was Grahatia's future and not ours. Yet the skills we had honed to make that dream a reality were still ours to employ. Another image flashed before me. I see a world pulled back from the brink. This time, Midgardsormr's booming laughter was unmistakable. "Very well. Under my protection shalt thou and thine rebuild, gaining newfound knowledge and the wisdom to wield it. Thus shall the children of man usher in a new astral era." And so our journey began anew. Would that Grahatia could see all that we will accomplish, though we shall remain forever on different pages of history, and different books besides. I take comfort in knowing we strive for a future of the self-same brightness. So that's it, the end of the final story in the Tales from the Shadows series. What'd you guys think? If you enjoyed this video, hit the like button, subscribe, ding that notification bell, and share the video with your friends. And if you want to buy me a coffee for my work, sign up to become a member of the channel. Until next time, guys. Later.